to the Wine Nirvana podcast. Wine reviews for the average wine drinker. No pretense, no snobbery, no numerical ratings. And here's our host, Stephen Hawk.
Thank you, Robin. Yes, Stephen Hawk, your wine guru, hoping to bring you wine enlightenment, or at least to guide you towards wines worth drinking. My guest today is Paul Wagner. He has spent a lifetime in the world of wine as a wine educator, an award-winning author, a competition judge, a guest lecturer, the owner of a wine marketing firm, a consultant, a magazine columnist, and a radio personality. He now claims to be retired, and yet he has a brand new book that was just released yesterday, and we will get to that later. Paul, thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure, Stephen. I'm just a little concerned. I'm retired, but you make it sound like I should be exhausted.
That's what I thought when I first wrote this. Geez, it was exhausting to read it, much less live it.
Well, it was all fun. That's that. I mean, I think if there's one thing I'd take away from all of that, I did it all because it was all fun.
So in 2009, you were officially recognized for your wine career by being granted the Life Dedicated to Wine Award from the Feria Nacional del Vino of Spain.
And you even got the Castilian Nacional in there. I'm impressed.
You prepared yourself for a life in wine by studying sociology and classical guitar. So
it's true.
Tell us about that transition.
Well, I was at the University of California, studying sociology and education and enjoying that, but also realizing that there was something more I wanted to do in the world than just be a teacher. I didn't want to be a sociologist. And my my dad was a university or a community college professor, and he had taken a year off, a sabbatical, to go to live in the UK and study the American Revolution from the British point of view. And I thought that was a perfect excuse for me to drop out of college, which I did, and go visit them. And they weren't going to complain that I went to visit them because, of course, I'm their kid. But from there, I went down to Spain, bought a guitar, met some wonderful people, and ended up spending almost 5 years in Spain studying classical guitar, teaching English, learning to speak Spanish with a true Castilian accent, and in many ways learned more in Spain than I did in the university. So that was a pivotal part of my life, and it really gave me a much broader appreciation of what wine and culture are all about. And that's one of the classes I teach at Napa Valley College, is a class called the Cultural Appreciation of Wine.
A major component of your career was at Napa Valley College's Viticulture and Enology department.
Yep.
And so fill us in on your approach and your teaching philosophy.
Well, it's very funny because I got to know Dr. Stephen Krebs, who was the head of the program there. Wonderful, wonderful man who really created that program out of almost nothing. When he started, I think there were 11 students in the program, and by the time he retired, there were 450 students in the program, making it the largest wine education program at any accredited school in the world. And I'd gotten to know him and had done some projects with him through my communications agency, where when we wanted to reach out to academics, he was one of the people we reached out to. And at one point he said, I like the way you approach the business. I'd like you to teach our wine marketing and sales class here at Napa Valley College. And I said, well, I'd be interested in that, Stephen, but first of all, before I could make any commitment at all, I'd have to look at the curriculum. He said, oh, no problem. So he handed me a stack of 75, 100 pages. And what they had done up to that point was simply invite a bunch of different people from the industry and in to talk about what they knew. So on the one hand, you had wonderfully expert people, but there was no coordination of the class. There was no building upon concepts. I mean, it was just free form. Here's a whole bunch of information. Do with it what you will. And a week later, I walked back into his office and I kind of flipped the curriculum on his desk and I said, Stephen, there is no way in hell I could teach this, because if I were to teach this, I'd have to rewrite the entire curriculum from beginning to end. And he looked at me and he said, good.
Knock yourself out.
And I thought, well, that wasn't the way I was expecting this conversation to go. I was expecting to walk out of here without having anything to do. So I ended up rewriting the curriculum. And that curriculum ultimately became not only the curriculum for that class, which I've now taught for, I think this fall will be my 27th year. But a few years later, I was judging a wine competition, and a couple of the table monitors at the wine competition were two professors from Sonoma State in their wine business program. And we started talking about writing a book. And they said, well, we should write a book because we're all teaching wine marketing, but the problem is organizing all the material. And I said, that's not a problem, because I have PowerPoints for all of my lectures at Napa Valley College, and they're all in one booklet. And Liz Tosh, one of the other professors, turned to me and said, Paul, but the hard part is knowing what to leave out. And I said, I don't think you heard what I said. I've got it all right here in this. I've got a copy. So we literally, during one of the water breaks at the wine competition, walked out to the trunk of my car. I handed them each a copy of the lecture notes, and I said, just pick the chapters that you want to write, and I'll write the rest. And that's how the wine marketing and sales book got written and then got published, and ultimately has become not only the leading book on the subject throughout the world, but won an international, ultimately a lifetime international award for being the best wine book for professionals. So all of that coming out of the fact that Steve Krebs told me that I could go ahead and rewrite the curriculum from beginning to end.
Yeah, that's great. So are you teaching again this coming semester?
Yes.
Well, then you're not retired, are you?
Well, I'm retired from the agency business. I don't have clients calling me up and saying, we hired you 2 days ago. Why aren't we on this month's cover of the Wine Spectator? I no longer have to do that. I just have to get up in front of a bunch of bright, enthusiastic, motivated people of all ages. Because my students are anywhere from 20 years old up to 65 or 70, as old as I am. And I get to talk about wine with them, and that's fun.
Yeah, for sure. Just like we're doing right now.
That's right.
That's right. But let's talk about the agency. Even though you've stepped back from an active role, that company is Balzac Communications and Marketing.
Right.
So the first question is, why is it Balzac Communications instead of Wagner Communications?
Well, we're right now we are living through that reason, because when I first started that company, obviously, if I'm going to be a marketing communications guy, I need to understand branding. And one of the things I did not want to do was create a company that when it was time for me to retire, people would say, well, if it's Wagner Communications, where the hell's Wagner? So I started Balzac Communications with specifically that name in mind. I actually made a list of about 30 different names that I would consider and just kept crossing them off for one reason or another until there were only a couple left. And I finally decided Balzac was the best, partly because I know who Balzac is and most people don't. And so there's a wonderful element in consulting where it's important that you know at least one thing that your client doesn't know. And I know who Balzac was.
So this was the French writer,
Yep.
Honoré Balzac. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. What kind of services does Balzac Communications offer to clients?
Well, we started by being primarily a liaison between clients and the media. So a client would either say, I need more attention for my products, or I would like to get this news out about my products. And we would then, based on our reputation and our relationships with wine writers and food writers all over the country, call them up and get them stories. As early as maybe 2 or 3 years into that, I quickly realized that one of the big challenges was that many of the clients that were talking to us didn't really understand what their story was. Liz Slater has this wonderful line about every winery says, I'm a small family winery. I carefully select my vineyards. I handcraft my wines, and I've won some awards. And they think that's news. There are 10,000 wineries in America, and 9,950 of them fit that description.
Yes.
So saying here's the news, I always say that a winery has only two news stories. One of the day is it's founded, and the second one is the day it goes bankrupt. So if you don't have news, then you really need to think about what you're going to do and how you're going to manage the attention to make sure that people understand. And so a huge part of what we started doing was not so much contacting the media and saying we got a great story, but sitting down with the winery and saying, what exactly is your story, and how can we not only write this story, but how can we even maybe make changes in the way you are doing business to make it a better story? And that's really where the fun gets in. So that's eventually, we then started doing that. We had a graphic design department that would design everything from labels for Constellation and Kendall Jackson to doing little flyers for the local ag commissioner. We had all of that stuff going on and still do. Although now I think a big chunk of the business of Balzac is moving in the direction of social media rather than standard print media, as I'm sure you will know. That's where a lot of the action is.
It certainly is, inevitably so, and also, frankly, for better or for worse. But we seem to be on the bus as a culture. So over the years, what were both your satisfactions as well as frustrations in working with these clients?
I always like to say that some of my greatest satisfactions were the stories you never read, where a client had a serious problem and hired us to say, listen, it's really unfair that we should be singled out for this. And so we ended up talking to the journalist and convincing that journalist that writing a single story about a single winery, when either this was something that was a broad industry issue, or in fact, on the other end of things, really isn't quite the problem you think it is. You never read those stories. So that's one element of satisfaction. I was part of a team that worked with Seagram Chateau and Estate Wines Company to really kind of introduce New Zealand wine into the United States. Loved working on the project, loved working with the very bright and committed people, both in New Zealand and the US, who did that. But looking back, that's a project that turned out really well. So yeah, lots of things across the board that gave me a lot of pleasure.
Was the introduction of the Ken Crawford label part of that?
Well, the first label we brought in was called Brancott. Well, the funny part was in New Zealand, it was called Montana. And we fairly early realized that Montana was not going to be a good name for a wine brand in the USA. Too many people were going to think of cowboys and glaciers. So new name, picked a name of one of their vineyards down there. And Monkey Bay was one of their projects as well. And it all, it's changed hands so many times. It was through Allied de Mec and then Pernod Ricard, and really sort of pushed the button on New Zealand wine across the U.S.
A little factoid I recently learned was New Zealanders were pioneers in screw caps, and the statistic now is that something like 98% of New Zealand wines are under screw cap, which I find to be an amazing number, because the whole screw cap thing continues to be sort of, well, I don't know if it's controversial, but contentious as to whether that's a worthwhile closure or not.
The other packaging that Australia does to a huge extent is bag-in-box. And of course, if your concept of wine is having a glass of wine every night for dinner, bag-in-box is really a very good solution for that. The wine that you don't drink doesn't get oxidized. It's very easy to deal with. And both of those countries have really They have, in some ways, I always laugh when someone in the wine industry says this is very innovative, because in my experience, innovation in the wine industry means they've watched three other people do it first, and now they're going to call it an innovation. But both New Zealand and Australia are far more innovative. But I think that's also because their own social cultures are much less focused on wine as an upper crust beverage. We in America somehow have adopted that British sense that wine is the drink of the upper classes, not of My Fair Lady, but of her teacher, and that beer is the drink of the lower classes. And so we don't want wine to be simpler and easier in this country. We want it to retain that kind of exclusivity. Whereas in Australia and New Zealand, everybody drinks wine. I mean, Italy, the same thing, everybody drinks wine. And there's not a class distinction. But in the US, we, I think, still tend a little bit towards that old English concept that the Lord up there in the big house, in the manor house, he drinks wine, and all the rest of us worker bees down here in the workers' quarters, well, we're going to drink beer. And as a result, it's always been harder to sell screw caps to the US market, because a screw cap to most people in the US market says, this is not trying to be snobbish. This is trying to be approachable and friendly and accessible. And that's not what we want from wine.
I could not agree with you more. I think that is exactly the case. And I myself often will have wine out of a box. Like anything else, there's a range of quality. If you're a careful shopper, you can seek out some very nice wines in a box, and they're often a great value. And there's the ecological component, because there's not all that glass and carbon footprint from shipping, and boxes make a lot of sense, and hopefully more people will embrace them. I discovered you through the Great Courses. It's an online learning company with hundreds of courses on all kinds of things, but the one you did, it was a video series called The Instant Sommelier,
right,
which I found to be very enjoyable and informative. So how did you connect with the Great Courses company? I guess they're called officially the Teaching Company.
They're called the Teaching Company, but the product they produce is called the Great Courses. And it was sort of a funny story, because at one point I was thinking about retirement. I was sitting in my office
again.
Well, this was about the time I was retiring, pulling back from Balzac. I had a couple of years before, I had begun the process of selling the agency to one of the employees, Mike Wagner, who runs it now very successfully. And so I had given him my office. I moved into a smaller office and all the rest, and was just sort of there as a consultant and occasionally helped out on some projects and things. And I just started thinking about the lectures I was giving at the college, and thinking, I'll bet they would be interesting to a larger audience. So I was just, my wife we are, in fact, huge fans of Great Courses. And in fact, we'd listened to a number of lectures on a big variety of products by that time. And so I just looked the number up on on Google, and I just gave them a call and said, hey, I do wine, and I'm interested. Here's my name, and here's where I teach. And if you're ever interested in having some wine classes. They only had one other person talking about wine, an MW, who was doing very short little snippets on, here's what Zinfandel is all about in 90 seconds or something. So I thought there might be an interest. And literally within a week, I had an appointment set up to talk to their programming guy, who said, we want to hire you. And I said, well, okay, I'm delighted, but don't you want to, sort of see what I do and read what I write? And he said, we've seen videos of you online. You're going to be just fine. So sure enough, they asked me to write we sort of went roundabout, and it's sort of a funny story, because what I initially pitched to them was a story about looking at the world of wine through the eyes of the culture of the region that produces it. And they ultimately said, now what we want is for you to just explain the basics of wine to people, and help people find the wines that they're going to like the most. So that's how the instant sommelier came about. But then within a year, they called me back and said, we're also putting together content for Audible. And we'd like you to do this original project you had suggested, which is, it's called something like The World of Wine in 10 Glasses. And it approaches the wines of Italy through the culture of Italy and the wines of France through the culture. And so in the end, I ended up doing that series of lectures for Audible.
This question is sort of it's along the lines of, which is your favorite child? But
yeah.
Of all the roles that you had through your wine career, which one would you say is your favorite?
Well, in terms of just the sheer joy of doing it, I still think teaching and speaking in public is the most fun. A lot of people will say that's their greatest fear, but I love it. I mean, it was part of being trained as a classical guitarist. I love working with an audience. It is rewarding. It's fun. But I also look back, for years and years, we represented the Union de Grand Cru de Bordeaux. All the great chateaus of Bordeaux, made some wonderful friends there. That was a wonderful part of it. And just running the company, I really tried to create a company that I would want to work at, and had many, many employees go through that company. Eventually, it became known in the wine industry as Balzac University, because people would come to work for me for a few years, and then some large wine company would call up and say, we're going to offer you a lot more money to come work for us. So yeah, I have friends, colleagues, and ex-employees working all over the place in the world of wine.
If you could debunk one common myth about wine, what would it be?
Boy, there are so many.
No doubt there are.
I thought you promised me only easy questions.
We're tough here at Wine Nirvana.
Okay, so let me tackle this one. I think the single biggest myth in the world of wine is this whole concept that wine from a particular place tastes exactly the same all the time, and you can always recognize it. And a true wine connoisseur can stick his nose into a glass and within a minute come up with, this is the fourth growth from Saint-Julien. This is the 1934 Branner du Cru. It's just a complete load of crap. And I will tell you that the people who do recognize wines regularly either drink a ton of that wine or have additional outside information so that they know already that they're drinking wine from a certain place or a certain style or a certain kind. And I will give you the example of, I have judged a number of years at the Concours Mondial de Bruxelles, which is the biggest wine competition in Europe. All of the wines are tasted blind. The only thing we're given is vintage dates. And so we're given a flight of 10, sometimes 12, sometimes 6 or 8 wines to judge. And of course, being wine geeks, there are 250 of the world's greatest wine tasters in that room. And I'm on a panel with 4 other judges who are masters of wine and presidents of international, wine associations, etc. And the minute they take the wines away, we all turn to each other and say, what do you think those were? And the answer is, in almost every case, we were wrong. And we weren't trying to identify a specific vineyard or a specific winemaker. We were only trying to identify varietal and country of origin. And yet, the first year I did it, I kept track. We ultimately had 5 judges. We tasted 5 flights of wines a day, and we tasted for 3 days. So 5 times 3 is 15 times 5 judges. We had 75 chances for a judge to correctly identify a wine by the varietal and region, and we were right 8 times out of 75. And that includes the president of one of the most important associations in Bordeaux mistaking a group of wines from South Africa as Grand Cru Bordeaux. It includes completely stumping us on wines that we simply looked at each other and said, we have no idea what these are. And again, you see it in the movies, you read about it in books, you see it on television. Oh, he really knows his wines. I'm sorry, it's an illusion. It's a trick. And I can't think of a worse thing to tell a bunch of consumers then yes, you should be able to taste this wine and tell me what it is. Because frankly, the only cases where that works is when you already know which wines are likely to be in the mix. Now, at the Concours Mondial de Bruxelles, we had a group of red wines from the Balearic Islands, Mallorca, Menorca, Ibiza, Formentera, off the coast of Spain. We had a set of sparkling wines from Luxembourg. We had a group of rosés from the Eastern European, Moldova, etc. We had, again, those absolutely fabulous Bordeaux blends from South Africa. But the minute you start realizing, wait a minute, these aren't, I'm not just drawing on some rich English guy's cellar full of Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Champagne, but rather this could be anything from anywhere on the planet, then all bets are off. And there's no better example of that than that famous Paris tasting of 1976.
The Judgment of Paris, yes.
To me, the story of that tasting was not that the French judges selected based on a sort of arcane point system. They ended up selecting one of the California wines as being better than some of the very best French wines. That was not the story. The story was these experts were given in red and in white 6 French wines, 6 California wines. And not a single one of those judges tasted through those wines and said, wait a minute, I don't think some of these are French. I think some of these come from another place. Not one. So don't talk to me about how brilliant your palate is and how you can tell the difference until you're willing to sit down with me and taste 10 wines that I select and you tell me all about them. As far as I'm concerned, you're blowing smoke through the top of your hat.
Well, that is quite provocative because, as you know, a big part of studying for a master sommelier certification is doing exactly
That's right.
what you're talking about.
That's right.
And you're saying, no, not really.
Yeah, and there's another part of that, which is, those organizations are teaching, and I'm going to use a couple of examples that I always use. They're teaching what is Chablis. And the first thing they decide is, well, Chablis is northern Burgundy, so the grapes don't get as ripe, so it's tight, it's lean, it's chalky, et cetera, et cetera. Have you had Chablis recently? Were they tight and lean and chalky? Hell no. Because global warming and climate change means that Chablis is actually making, and winemaking styles are changing to the point where a lot of Chablis doesn't taste that way. So now, if you're going to take that Master Sommelier exam and they're going to give you a Chablis to identify, they have to go out and taste a bunch of Chablis to pick one to make sure that it tastes like what they told you Chablis tastes like. Now, if they have to taste a bunch of wines to make sure that they taste like what Chablis tastes like, they're not teaching what Chablis tastes like. They're teaching you what they say Chablis tastes like, but they're also recognizing there's a ton of Chablis out there that doesn't taste like that.
Yes.
In which case, Chablis doesn't taste like that. And Chianti Classico, love the wines, delicious wines, but they have completely changed their entire regulations about how they make it, the style they make it, the grapes they can use to make it. And so what are we teaching people? We're teaching people, oh no, you should be able to do this, when in fact, it's not important that you do. It is important that you understand how to describe wine in ways that your customers will understand. But even that, I find them to be horrifically incapable, because the classic descriptor of Bordeaux, the fruit character in Bordeaux, is cassis. How many Americans have had cassis? 1 in 1,000? 1 in 10,000? And yet we're telling you it tastes like cassis. And then the students will sit there and stick their nose in the glass and look up at you and say, oh yeah, I taste the cassis. They don't know what cassis is. So to me, as a teacher, this is not only ineffective, it's dishonest, and ultimately it is corrupting the way we understand and talk about wine, which is why you can tell I get a little excited about this topic.
And understandably so. I started Wine Nirvana for the casual wine drinker, basically for people who enjoy wine but don't know much about it, but would like to learn more. And so what suggestions do you have for wine drinkers who would like to expand their knowledge?
Well, I'll tell you a wonderful story about how I started teaching. I changed, in fact, the way I teach sensory analysis at Napa Valley College. And for years, I teach the wines of California. I've taught wines of the world there, wines of Germany, wines of Spain, wines of France. And always in the first class, I give them 2 wines and I say, okay, before we do anything else, let's just make sure we're all paying attention to the same things as we drink wine. So I give them 2 glasses of wine, and let's use an example, a Chardonnay and a Sauvignon Blanc. And I used to start out by saying, you have 2 glasses in front of you. Glass on the left is Sauvignon Blanc, glass on the right is Chardonnay. And Sauvignon Blanc comes from Bordeaux and the Loire Valley in France, and it's kind of an herbal wine. You'll get some sort of grassy notes and maybe some cat pee or something like that. And the Chardonnay from Burgundy in France, and it often gets aged in oak, so you're going to see a little vanilla there. And this is a California version, so the fruit's kind of tropical. Do you see that? And all the students would sniff and smell and nod and yeah. And then I'd say, okay, I want you to close your eyes and ask your neighbor to switch the glasses. The neighbor would switch the glasses, and then I'd say, okay, go back and identify the wine. And about 75% of the students would be able to identify the wine. Now, given that there were only 2 wines, 50% would have been random. So 75% is not a great percentage in that little exercise there. And about 5 years ago, I put the 2 glasses in front of them and I started to talk. And I said, Paul, this is a place where you need to learn how to shut up. So I said, I'm not going to tell you anything about the wines. I'm going to ask you to lean on the words of, I think it was Johannes Kepler, who said, we explore the world with our 5 senses and call the result science. So I want you to use at least 4 of your senses. I want you to look at it. I want you to smell it. I want you to taste it. I want you to feel how it feels in your mouth. And I want you to write down in your words how these 2 wines are different. And if you think one smells like your grandmother's closet and the other one reminds you of a tree you banged your head on when you were hiking in the mountains, fine. I don't care. All I care about is that you're able to describe this wine to yourself so that you can tell the difference. So everybody did that. Then I said, okay, I want you to close your eyes, switch to glasses, identify the wines. 100% of the students got it right.
Fascinating.
So I learned right there that the biggest mistake we make in teaching people wine is we tell them what to expect. And of course, as a marketer, my job is to tell people what to expect before they open the bottle. That's what marketing's all about. But as an educator, if someone's interested in learning about wine, I would do exactly that exercise. Put 2 glasses in front of yourself, or if you really want to do it scientifically, 2 glasses of one wine and 1 glass of the other. And just go back and forth, completely blind. You shouldn't know a thing about them, and just give your senses the opportunity to learn from the glass. And after a while, you will begin to say, I like this or I don't like that. And then you can go into a wine shop and say, okay, I've tasted a few things. I like these. I'm not so wild about those. What do you got that's interesting? And now you're on your way, because now you already have that ultimate foundation of this is what I like.
Right. A genuine criteria for what you prefer.
Yep.
And as we know, the first rule is drink what you like. There's no doubt about that.
And it's funny, when I'm on an airplane and somebody's sitting next to me and we start talking, when they find out I was I play guitar, and I still do play classical guitar quite a lot. First thing they do, oh, you know what kind of music I like? And they tell me about the music they like. When they find out I'm in the wine industry, the first thing they do is say, oh, what do you think I should be drinking?
Mm-hmm.
We have created that. We in the wine industry have made these people, they're perfectly comfortable talking about the music they love. They're afraid to talk about the wine they like. And that is criminally bad business management.
It is indeed. And it so detracts from the enjoyment of wine that people are made to feel ignorant or inadequate or whatever.
Right.
Because wine is a beverage of pleasure, and I'm with you that that somehow we have boxed people into being intimidated by this topic when that should be the farthest thing from the truth.
Well, and you still see these stories about how if you like a certain wine, if you don't like big red wines, eventually your palate will mature to the point where you will like them. And I just think that's dishonest. I mean, if there's one thing we've learned over the last, say, 25 years in terms of sensory analysis and all the rest, it's everyone has their own genetic code in terms of how they respond to sights, smells, and particularly smells and flavors. And for us to tell people that eventually, if they grow up, they'll like the same kind of wines we like, when it is quite possible that the reason they don't like those wines is they are super sensitive, for example, to bitterness, and they find the tannin in red wines obnoxious. And here we are telling them that when they grow up, they'll learn to drink it. And the truth is, they have a more sensitive palate than we do.
So once again, drink what you like.
Drink what you like. That shouldn't stop you from going out and trying to find good wines.
No.
If you know, for example, that you prefer wines that are sweet, then go out and buy some really great sweet wines and give yourself some real pleasure.
Indeed. I mentioned at the top of our segment that you have a new book out. It is called Danger, Falling Rocks. It is a murder mystery, and naturally, after a lifetime in the world of wine, the plot has nothing to do with wine whatsoever. So tell us about that.
It's true. When I was a baby, first summers of my life, my dad was a teacher, but in the summers he worked as a ranger up in the parks in the Sierra, and so I grew up there. And I have always loved hiking and backpacking in the Sierra. We have our own website that's a non-commercial site that just encourages people to go backpacking. It's called Backpack the Sierra. And I love the idea of, I've taken up in my retirement, taking up painting. And what I paint is scenes in the mountains because that's where I'm really happy. And a few years ago, my daughter was living in Argentina and complained about not having enough English content to read. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to write her a book. I kind of had an idea for a book, so I sat down and I wrote her a murder mystery that takes place up in the mountains. And it was sort of fun, and I ended up liking the character I created and his friend. And so I wrote the book and sent it off to her, and she loved it. And so did her sister. And so I wrote another one. And I have now written 4 of these. And Val de Grace Books has decided they think they're good enough. They're going to publish all 4 as a series. And again, part of the joy of this is that if it's a rainy day in the wintertime, I can sit in front of my computer and imagine, admittedly, there's a rampaging murderer somewhere around there, but I'm also up in the mountains having fun. In my imagination, reliving a lot of the hikes and the experiences I've had up there. So that's the story behind that first book, and so far it's gotten some pretty good reviews, so I'm kind of excited about it.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, and you made it easy, Stephen.
And thank you, listener, for joining me. And as usual, I will leave you with this quote from W.C. Fields, perhaps America's greatest philosopher. I'm reminded of my safarian effort. Somebody forgot the corkscrew, and for several days we had to live on nothing but food and water.
This has been Wine Nirvana. To learn more, visit us at www.winenirvana.com. This is a production of Habanero Media.